Last time on A Christmas Carol Deep Dive, we covered the first half of the third stave, called The Second of the Three Spirits, which deals with the ghost of Christmas present. Today we will be continuing that stave through to its conclusion. It's one of the most influential books ever written. Even if you've never read Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, you are familiar with it. My name is Colin Murr, and I've loved this story for as long as I can remember. I'm going to be taking a look at all of the movie and TV adaptations of A Christmas Carol that I can, because I love the story that much. This is Scrooge, the Christmas Carol podcast. A Christmas Carol Deep Dive, the second of the three spirits, part 2. When we left the story at the end of the last episode, Scrooge and the ghost of Christmas present had just left the Cratchit's house, and that is where we will pick up today. I will turn it back over to Kyle Mundley in his reading of A Christmas Carol, and I will be back with facts, historical context, analysis, and more.
By this time it was getting dark and snowing pretty heavily, and as Scrooge and the spirit went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in kitchens, parlors, and all sorts of rooms were wonderful. Here, the flickering of the blaze showed preparations for a cozy dinner, with hot plates baking through and through before the fire, and deep red curtains ready to be drawn to shut out cold and darkness. There all the children of the house were running out into the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, and be the first to greet them. Here again were shadows on the window blind of guests assembling, and there a group of handsome girls, all hooded and fur-booted, and all chattering at once, tripped lightly off to some near neighbor's house, where, woe upon the single man who saw them enter, artful witches, well they knew it, in a glow. But if you had judged from the numbers of people on their way to friendly gatherings, you might have thought that no one was at home to give them welcome when they got there, instead of every house expecting company, and piling up its fires half-chimney high. Blessings on it, how the ghost exulted! How it bared its breadth of breast, and opened its capacious palm, and floated on, outpouring with a generous hand its bright and harmless mirth on everything within reach. The very lamplighter, who ran on before, dotting the dusky street with specks of light, and who was dressed to spend the evening somewhere, laughed out loudly as the spirit passed, though little kenned the lamplighter that he had any company but Christmas.
I've heard it said that the ghost of Christmas present is never explicitly stated to be Father Christmas, but I think this instance is in fact pretty explicit. He was also called Old Christmas or simply Christmas, so saying that he had any company but Christmas is outright saying who this ghost is.
And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about, as though it were a burial place of giants. And water spread itself wheresoever it listed, or would have done so, but for the frost that held it prisoner, and nothing grew but moss and furze, and coarse rank grass. Down in the west the setting sun had left a streak of fiery red, which glared upon the desolation for an instant like a sullen eye, and frowning lower, lower, lower yet, was lost in the thick gloom of darkest night. "What is this place?" asked Scrooge. "A place where miners live, who labor in the bowels of the earth," returned the spirit. "But they know me. See!" A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly they advanced toward it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled round a glowing fire. An old, old man and woman, with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing them a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy, and from time to time they all joined in the chorus.
Just a note for those who are curious. God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen dates back in some form to the 17th century. So if you're picturing him singing that song, it fits. In the 1951 film Scrooge, it's Hark the Herald Angels Sing, which would also fit the time frame. There's a future version we haven't gotten to which uses Silent Night here, but that would not fit this qualifier.
So surely as they raised their voices, the old man got quite blithe and loud, and so surely as they stopped, his vigor sank again. The spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his robe, and passing on above the moor, sped whither? Not to sea. To sea. To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw the last of the land, a frightful range of rocks behind them. And his ears were deafened by the thundering of water as it rolled and roared and raged among the dreadful caverns it had worn and fiercely tried to undermine the earth. Built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks, some league or so from shore, on which the waters chafed and dashed the wild year through, there stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm-birds, born of the wind one might suppose, as seaweed of the water, rose and fell about it, like the waves they skimmed. But even here, two men who watched the light had made a fire, that through the loophole in the thick stone wall shed out a ray of brightness on the awful sea. Joining their horny hands over the rough table at which they sat, they wished each other Merry Christmas in their can of grog. And one of them, the elder, too, with his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather, as the figurehead of an old ship might be, struck up a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself. Again the ghost sped on, above the black and heaving sea, on and on, until, being far away, as he told Scrooge, from any shore, they lighted on a ship. They stood beside the helmsman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow, the officers who had the watch. Dark, ghostly figures in their several stations, but every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day, with homeward hopes belonging to it. And every man on board, waking or sleeping, good or bad, had had a kinder word for another on that day than on any day in the year, and had shared to some extent in its festivities, and had remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him.
I love this portion of the story and the way it's written. We visit three different locations where we would never think of people celebrating Christmas. Places where it's quite easy to lose track of time altogether. Underground, in a lighthouse, at sea. I mean, these are three places where in stories people often feel like they're losing their minds because they've lost track of time. But yet, in all three of these locations, Dickens shows a similar Christmas celebration. It doesn't glorify these workers' challenging situations, but like the Cratchits, we see that they all find a way to celebrate the holiday nonetheless. I am always thrilled to see adaptations go for it and include these scenes, and I think the Richard Williams cartoon from 1971 really succeeds at this wonderfully.
It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind, and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, whose depths were secrets as profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at that same nephew with approving affability. "Ha, ha!" laughed Scrooge's nephew. "Ha, ha, ha!" If you should happen, by any unlikely chance, to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is, I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance. It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things, that while there is infection and disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece, by marriage, laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, being not a bit behindhand, roared out lustfully.
Quick note about the audiobook there. He says lustfully. It's actually lustily. That might create a slightly different image in your head. Scrooge says that his nephew is poor, but there's no indication anywhere in the text that he actually is. We do see real poverty in this book, and it's clearly not something Fred is going through, as he is newly married and owns a house where he can invite many friends to Christmas.
Ha ha! Ha 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 ha! He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live! Cried Scrooge's nephew. He believed it, too. More shame for him, Fred, said Scrooge's niece indignantly. Bless those women, they never do anything by halves. They are always in earnest. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, and no doubt it was. All kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. Altogether she was what you would have called provoking, you know, but satisfactory, too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. He's a comical old fellow, said Scrooge's nephew. That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. I'm sure he's very rich, Fred, hinted Scrooge's niece. At least you always tell me so. What of that, my dear? Said Scrooge's nephew. His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking that he is ever going to benefit us with it. I have no patience with him, observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters, and all the other ladies, expressed the same opinion. Oh, I have, said Scrooge's nephew. I am sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner. Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner, interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had dinner, and, with the dessert upon the table, were clustered round the fire by lamplight. Well, I'm very glad to hear it, said Scrooge's nephew, because I haven't great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper? Topper had clearly got his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject. Whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. Do go on, Fred, said Scrooge's niece, clapping her hands. He never finishes what he begins to say. He is such a ridiculous fellow. Scrooge's nephew revelled in another laugh, and, as it was impossible to keep the infection off, though the plump sister tried hard to do it with aromatic vigor, his example was unanimously followed. I was only going to say, said Scrooge's nephew, that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us, and not making merry with us, is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments, which could do him no harm. I am sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his mouldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him, if he finds me going there in good temper year after year, and saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something, and I think I shook him yesterday. It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge. But, being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, so that they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment, and passed the bottle joyously. For they were a musical family, and knew what they were about when they sung a glee or catch, I can assure you. Especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one, and never swell the large veins in his forehead, or get red in the face over it.
A glee referred to a song sung in harmony, while a catch was a round. Each new singer would have to catch their part when it came up. These kinds of songs were extremely popular in England at the time.
Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played among other tunes a simple little air, a mere nothing, you might learn to whistle it in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding-house, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. When this strain of music sounded, all the things that ghost had shown him came up in his mind. He softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness of life for his own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton's spade that buried Jacob Marley.
This is such a profound little aside, and it's really easy to skim over. There is a mention of a song that is familiar to the boy who picked up Scrooge at school. Again, in that situation, the boy represents someone less fortunate. If Scrooge thought of that song and that boy more throughout his life, Dickens suggests that he would have been a better man. Music can have a profound impact on us, and sometimes we hear a song we haven't heard in years that immediately takes us back to another time and place. When I posted on social media about specific parts of the book that people might want me to include in this analysis, the Blue Sky user Gregory Maupin wrote that his adaptation includes this small moment, and that, quote, "it punches me whenever it turns up," unquote. The 1951 film does have a version of this scene, but it's a good bit different. When Fan appears to get young Scrooge from school, an instrumental version of the ballad Barbara Allen plays. Then, when Scrooge attends Fred's party at the end, the group is singing the song Barbara Allen when Scrooge enters. It's not exactly what's going on here, but I think it is trying to reference that in some way. But I really do like this whole aside about if only Scrooge had thought about that more in his life, that little thing where he could have helped someone out. He could have come to being a better person much more organically.
But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played at forfeits, for it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself.
Forfeits is a children's game where everyone puts an article of clothing or an accessory in a pile. Someone holds up an item, and the judge says that if the owner of the item wants that item back, they have to do some kind of stunt.
Stop. There was first a game at Blind Man's Bluff. Of course there was. And I no more believe Topper was really blind than I believe he had eyes in his boots. My opinion is that it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and that the ghost of Christmas Present knew it. The way he went after that plump sister in the lace tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature. Knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping against the piano, smothering himself among the curtains. Wherever she went, there went he. He always knew where the plump sister was. He couldn't catch anybody else. If you had fallen against him, and some did, on purpose, he would have made a feint of endeavoring to seize you, which would have been an affront to your understanding, and would instantly have sidled off in the direction of the plump sister. She often cried out that it wasn't fair, and it really was not. But when at last he caught her, when, in spite of all her silken rustlings and her rapid flutterings past him, he got her into a corner whence there was no escape, then his conduct was the most execrable. For his pretending not to know her, his pretending that it was necessary to touch her headdress, and further, to assure himself of her identity by pressing a certain ring upon her finger, and a certain chain about her neck, was vile, monstrous. No doubt she told him her opinion of it, when, another blind man being in office, they were so very confidential together behind the curtains. Scrooge's niece was not one of the blind man's bluff party, but was made comfortable with a large chair and a footstool in a snug corner, where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her.
Scrooge's niece sitting in a chair and not participating in some of the games, maybe, as many have suggested over the years, Dickens implying that she's pregnant. There is a callback to this in the final stave, which only furthers the hypothesis.
But she joined in the forfeits, and loved her love to admiration with all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise, at the game of how, when, and where, she was very great, and to the secret joy of Scrooge's nephew, beat her sisters hollow, though they were sharp girls too, as Topper could have told you.
How, when, and where is a guessing game that involves words with multiple definitions. The guesser leaves the room as the others come up with a word. The 1916 book, My Book of Indoor Games, gives the word spring as an example, because that has many definitions. There's a spring of water, a spring on a bed, you get the idea. So the guesser would ask a question like, how do you like it? And the others would give answers like dry, meaning the season of spring, or cold and clear, meaning a spring of water. Then the guesser asks, when do you like it? With similarly varied answers. And finally, where do you like it? If the guesser can figure it out based on this, the last person who answered becomes the new guesser. Otherwise, the guesser must try again.
There might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played. And so did Scrooge, for, wholly forgetting in the interest he had in what was going on that his voice made no sound in their ears, he sometimes came out with his guess quite loud, and, very often, guessed quite right, too. For the sharpest needle, best Whitechapel warranted not to cut in the eye, was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it in his head to be. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favor that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guests departed. But this, the spirit said, could not be done. "Here is a new game," said Scrooge. "1/2 hour, spirit, only one." It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what. He only answering to their questions, yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, a rather disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the streets, and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anybody, and didn't live in a menagerie, and was never killed in a market, and was not a horse, or an ass, or a cow, or a bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last, the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out, "I have found it! I know what it is, Fred! I know what it is!" "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge!" Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, though some objected that the reply to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been "Yes," inasmuch as an answer in the negative was sufficient to have diverted their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing they had ever had any tendency that way. "He has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure," said Fred, "and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready to our hand at the moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge." "Well, Uncle Scrooge!" they cried.
The contrast here to the Cratchits is understandable. Outside of Fred and perhaps Fred's wife, these people don't know Scrooge, so they have no problem somewhat jokingly drinking his health. The Cratchits know how he treats Bob and do not want to wish him well under any circumstance.
"A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, wherever he is," said Scrooge's nephew. "He wouldn't take it from me, but may he have it nevertheless. Uncle Scrooge!" Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return, and thanked them in an inaudible speech, if the ghost had given him the time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful; on foreign lands, and they were close at home; by struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope; by poverty, and it was rich; in an almshouse, hospital, and jail; in misery's every refuge, where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door and barred the spirit out, he left his blessing, and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night. But Scrooge had his doubts of this, because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into the space of time they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed the change, but never spoke of it, until they left a children's Twelfth Night party, when, looking at the spirit as they stood in an open place, he noticed that its hair was gray.
Twelfth Night parties happen in early January, as they represent the end of the 12 days of Christmas. There was a reference to a Twelfth Night cake earlier, and these are king cakes, which have a Christ figurine in them. These would later become a staple of Mardi Gras. They are also called Three Kings cakes, representing the three magi or wise men, sometimes called kings, who visited Jesus. This is because, in Western Christianity, the holiday of Epiphany mainly celebrates the visit of the three wise men. In Eastern Christianity, its focus is on Jesus' baptism as an adult. Either way, in the book, as Dickens says in the text, it seems that Christmas is covering the whole Christmas season in Christmas Present, while in most adaptations there's no indication it's anything more than a single night.
"Are spirits' lives so short?" asked Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight." "Tonight?" cried Scrooge. "Tonight at midnight. Hark! The time is drawing near." The chimes were ringing the 11:75 at that moment. "Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe, "but I see something strange, and not belonging to yourself, protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?" "It might be a claw, for the flesh there is upon it," was the spirit's sorrowful reply. "Look here." From the foldings of its robe it brought two children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet, and clung upon the outside of its garment. "Oh, man, look here! Look! Look down here!" exclaimed the ghost. They were a boy and girl, yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate, too, in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out, and touched them with its freshest tints, a stale and shriveled hand, like that of age, had pinched and twisted them, and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked, and glared out menacingly. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade through all the mysteries of wonderful creation has monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge stared back, appalled. Having them shown to him in this way, he tried to say they were fine children, but the words choked themselves, rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude. "Spirit, are they yours?" Scrooge could say no more. "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down upon them. "And they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both, and all their degree. But most of all beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased." "Deny it," cried the spirit, stretching out his hand towards the city. "Slander those who tell it ye. Admit it for your own fascist purposes, and make it worse, and bide the end."
This is very possibly the creepiest moment in a story filled with creepy moments. These two children, ignorance and want, represent the poverty that people like Scrooge refuse to do anything about. By turning a blind eye and being ignorant about it, it creates people who are in constant want of basic necessities. Earlier, the charity workers said, "Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comfort, sir." Now Scrooge has to confront this want head on. Of course, the want could have a double meaning and refer to his want for more gain as well. So, why do these children hide under the robe of the ghost of Christmas present? Christmas may be a time that shields the needs a lot of people are struggling with, particularly if people are helping them out during Christmas time. However, once Christmas ends, the horrible reality rears its ugly head again, and again, we have to face it head on. We can say that Christmas is a good and charitable time, but we need to be helping those less fortunate all the time, and this is what Dickens means by keeping Christmas in your heart year round.
"Have they no refuge or resource?" cried Scrooge. "Are there no prisons?" said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. "Are there no workhouses?" The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and, lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him. End of Stave 3.
Okay, so that is the end of stave 3, the second of the three spirits. That is the longest stave in the book, and that's why I knew it would have to be divided into two episodes because there is a whole lot in this portion of the book. And as I've said, a lot of adaptations will often make this section fairly short, all things considered. The cliche in my head, which often plays out in the adaptations, is Ghost takes Scrooge to the Cratchits, and then Ghost takes Scrooge to Fred's. Maybe that's it. In some cases, he'll show ignorance and want if it's a darker adaptation. Others will show some of the joyousness of Christmas. Maybe they'll walk the streets, musical versions in particular. They'll have the ghost walk the streets with Scrooge. But as I've said, I really love those versions where we get the part with the lighthouse keepers and the sailors and the miners. Because, like I said, these are three places where not only would we not think of Christmas being celebrated, but these are places where you might lose your mind according to the thought of the time and even now. I mean, there are horror movies about losing your mind underground, losing your mind in a lighthouse, and losing your mind at sea, so we get all three of them here. And yet, Dickens instead portrays it as a place where people are celebrating, and it's just a wonderful scene. I wish more versions included it because it's such a wonderful portion of the book. And we've talked about a few that have, but yeah, it's one of my favorite pieces in the whole book. And ignorance and want is one where I feel you just have to include that in one form or another. If you don't actually include the ignorance and want scene, you have to include those themes. I think the 1935 film, even while it doesn't have ignorance and want, I think it includes the themes very, very well of poverty and how Scrooge needs to help the poor because we get all those wonderful scenes of you have the Lord Mayor's banquet and then you have all the people in London celebrating. Yeah, I think it could have had the children in that movie and it would have been great, but it still covers those themes very well. But yeah, I'm gonna judge a film pretty partially if it doesn't include some version of that because that's the whole book. You're not paying attention. You have to keep Christmas the whole year long, which is looking out for those less fortunate. Ignorance and want may not rear their ugly head during Christmas, but once Christmas is over, you got to keep looking out for those things. And that's why they hide under the robe. And I really, really think it's a crucial scene to the whole story. And it also sets the scene nicely for Christmas Yet to Come's more dark take on everything. So it leaves things on a very dark note and opens up a world of very, very dark scenes in the future. So, yeah, a very crucial scene. I mentioned that some people say that Fred's wife might be pregnant, and that's why she's sitting on a stool. And we'll talk more about this in the future, in the final stave as well. Maybe I'll do an episode sometime where I talk about, I don't know that I want to say conspiracy theories, but like, different alternative interpretations of the story, theories people have. Very, very lighthearted kind of video where I just riff on some of those theories, what I think about them. I've talked about some of these as well, from the believable to the ridiculous, such as Dickens didn't even write A Christmas Carol. There are people out there who think that. So, you know, I could look at some of those. It'd be a very funny, lighthearted video. It would not be anything too serious. If there's something I think is actually important to discussing about A Christmas Carol, that's an interpretation like people who think Scrooge is Jewish. I would have talked about it already, and I have. But I could do a video like that sometime if that's something people want to see. But yeah, I think it absolutely leaves it open for interpretation that Fred's wife is pregnant. Maybe that's what he was going for, maybe not. But I think with Dickens kind of, I don't want to say cutesy, but kind of, yeah, his writing style, I think, is kind of what he's hinting at. It makes sense to me with all the games that they play at Fred's party, and they play a lot of games. There are still versions that had their own. The 1970 musical with Albert Finney, they played this game that I believe is called The Minister's Cat, where you have to like go sit in a circle and add a different quality about the cat. It's so ridiculous, but it's a musical game, so I get why they wanted to include it in a musical. I remember the Jacob Marley is Dead podcast had a big laugh at that game, just how ridiculous it was. So yeah, that and there's one that they play a similes game, which I think is more in line with the books game. Like you get the beginning of the simile and you have to fill in like tight as blank. So even though it's not in the book, it feels just like one of the games. So each version will kind of do its own thing with that. Some will add their own games. But yeah, Dickens really liked writing about all the joy that comes with celebrating Christmas with your friends, and that's why the Fred scene is so nice because we see the Cratchits, we see they're struggling, but they have each other, they love each other, and then Fred, who is just friends hanging out, having a good time, and it's a really fun scene. Get to see them really basking in all the joy of Christmas, and I like that he doesn't limit himself with the writing. He goes all out. It's lavish and wonderful, and they're having a great time, and you can tell. And again, Fred's not poor. Scrooge says he's poor. It's not even an alternate interpretation of the book. It's just clear in the book that Scrooge thinks he's poor, and no one else would ever think Fred is poor. He is clearly doing well for himself, and it's ridiculous to read the text any other way. So I think the final two staves will each be one episode on their own. However, we're going to put those off a month because this episode comes out in June. Episode after that will come out in July. And believe it or not, there is actually a July 4th Christmas Carol. Well, not Christmas, obviously, but a July 4th Carol. Yeah, it's called An American Carol, not to be confused with An American Christmas Carol with Henry Winkler, which I love. It's great. We talked about that. An American Carol. It's a parody. It's political from the 2000s. We'll leave it at that for now. But yeah, it's going to be its own episode in July because it takes place on the 4th of July. It's about a character who doesn't love the 4th of July enough. Yeah, you can see where it's going alone with that. But it's a parody version set on the 4th of July. So we will talk about that in July. And I've written that up and there's a lot to say. But anyway, that's next month, and then after that, back to the final staves of A Christmas Carol with all this analysis. So stay tuned for that episode, and thank you for listening to another episode of Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast is written, edited, and hosted by Colin Murr. Theme music is Christmas Day by TRG Banks. The LibriVox audiobook in this episode is A Christmas Carol, read by Kyle Munley. You can find all the sources for this episode linked in the description. Leaving a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing on YouTube will be a big help to me. I'll be back next month with another episode of Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. Until then, make sure to live in the past, the present, and the future, and ensure that the spirits of all three strive within you.